If you're a professional brewer, you know how frustrating it can be when you go to place a yeast order and what you're looking for is out of stock. Well, Imperial Yeast is here to help by guaranteeing that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 10, yes, 10 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. Some of these strains include A38 Juice for those hazy IPAs, A07 Flagship, a classic in clean American styles, L13 Global, which is said to be one of the world's most popular lager strains, A44 Kviking for your warm fermented beers, and so many more. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it's time to up your game. You can check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. When making hoppy styles of beer like IPA and even modern American Pale Ale, brewers rely on various hopping methods, one of which is the dry hop, where a dose of hops are added sometime during or after fermentation. Likely inspired by the pungency this method imparts to beer, some creative folks out there began doing the same thing to plain old water. And similar to beer, there's a bit of controversy as to the most effective approach. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss the impact hop contact time has when making hop water is contributor Will Lovell.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of sparkling water in general, and just so happens that I have some hops that are extra that are hanging around all the time, and so hop water to me was like a no-brainer to give it a shot, and I think it's a really great beverage, so I'm really excited to talk about it with you.
Yeah, hop water has definitely grown in popularity since I first heard of it many years ago, in fact. And while I've never actually made a batch myself, which is odd because I too absolutely love sparkling water, as do my kids, I have tried numerous commercial versions as well as a handful of hop waters made by homebrewers. It's really good stuff, and I'm looking forward to learning a bit more about this novel beverage today. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for this month, April of 2024, is Dana Garvis, founder of Oregon Brew Lab. In addition to being an accomplished home brewer, Dana is a trained brewing chemist who helped build the quality control lab at Ninkasi Brewing Company. If you've ever had their beers, you know how cool of a job that is. Before starting her own company in 2016, Oregon Brew Lab offers a variety of essential analyses for affordable prices to both commercial and home brewers. Brewlosophy has worked with Oregon Brew Lab many times over the years, and Dana is truly an awesome member of the brewing community. I'm really looking forward to this session. If you want to be a part of it, be sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more by this Friday, April 26, 2024, as Dana is going to be taking questions on Saturday the 27th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook and Patreon pages, so folks can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate that. Not only does it give us an idea of what you all think about how we're doing, but it helps those who may not have heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who, in addition to having a remarkable YouTube channel chock full of great brewing-related content, sell what we believe to be some of the best electric systems on the market. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you owe it to yourself to check out Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're after a 120-volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240-volt 10-gallon system, Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything they have to offer over at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. All right, listener and patron of Brewlosophy, Dave Chebby from the Franconia region of Germany wrote in after listening to episode 315 where we focused on Belgian Triple. I believe that was an episode you were on with me, Will, so this is going to be relevant for you. Dave says, when I drove back to my home area yesterday, I tuned into the latest episode, and I greatly appreciate the show about Belgian Triple. Marshall and Will, you guys make an incredible team, and it almost appears like you knew each other for the better part of your lives. Well, that is a nice compliment, Will. Dave says, so much fun that was. was. Anyway, the resulting 53% efficiency sparked some thoughts that I'd like to share with you. Will mentioned he used a slightly under-modified malt along with a single infusion mash that was shortened and at pretty low temperature. My guess is that the fewer enzymes present in the malt didn't quite finish conversion, resulting in a hit in gravity and maybe even some remaining unconverted starches. The latter could be a cause for the haze that was apparent in the triple for the first few weeks. You're probably familiar with the iodine test, and while I don't do it regularly, I like to perform it when trying new malts or maltsters. I guess a slightly longer mashing time or different mashing schedule could have promoted a more complete conversion. The only thing that I still wonder about is the very low FG, as that speaks against an incomplete conversion. Also, I picked up that the gelatinization temperature of barley drastically rose over the last years, and some European maltsters recommended mashing in at 66C, which is like 66C. I don't even know what that is in Fahrenheit, and lowering the temperature after that to encourage beta amylase activity like Will did.
So that was a really fun recipe to brew, and my Google machine says 66C is about 150 Fahrenheit. Going off memory, I think I went low. I went really low. Like I wanted to play with, can I do 146 Fahrenheit mash? And so I went lower than I normally would and kind of pushed the limits. And so I think we got okay conversion, but generally my efficiency just takes that kind of hit from doing that shortened, abbreviated mash step. And so it's just something I've come to expect. So I just think there's probably most of the conversion has occurred. It's just that for the last 30 minutes, we could have probably eked out, if we would have done a full hour, the last 30 minutes would have eked out just a few more points. But otherwise, it was dry as a bone beer, but we also added a ton of sugar to make it that way. So, so I think that helps explain why we may have gotten a really low FG as well.
Yeah. Dave obviously knows what he's talking about. This guy's a really accomplished home brewer back in Germany, and he's a great member of our Patreon crew as well. I don't really have much else to add. I've actually done the iodine test when I first started doing the short and shoddy series. I don't even think we were doing going through the BJCP style guidelines yet. I was just kind of throwing stuff together and seeing what happens if you cut all of these. You abbreviate all these processes. I did the iodine test on probably 10 batches, and it was always fully converted. It's just that there wasn't as much conversion overall, I guess, and I'm not going to pretend to always know why that is. The one thing I can say with pretty decent amount of confidence is that if you mash for 30 minutes, or if I mash for 30 minutes, I should say, I'm going to get about 5 points, give or take, 2 or 3 lower than if I were to mash for a full hour. Now, if you have the time to mash for an hour, then go and do it. I mean, part of our reason for doing short and shoddy is just to kind of demonstrate how robust the brewing process is and the ingredients that we're using are. You can make really good, award-winning beers by not doing it the traditional way, and that's pretty cool. That doesn't mean you have to. It's not like we're encouraging people to do that. Again, Dave, you're a smart dude. It may very well be that was, what you're proposing is accurate. I don't know, but that's what it is. So thank you so much for reaching out to us, Dave. And also, I know it's a little bit late, but happy birthday. I hope you had a good birthday. All right, if you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. When we're back from this break, our focus will be on the impact different hop contact times have on hop water. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Hello, Saver. Whether you're saving for that trip to the tropics or saving for an emergency, now is the time to take advantage of Wells Fargo's savings options. Wells Fargo offers savings accounts that can help you save towards your goals. So, what are you saving for? Visit a Wells Fargo branch or wellsfargo.com/save to open a savings account today.
Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
Before Shopify, were you wondering, where are my sales at? Now you're selling with Shopify, the global commerce platform supercharging your selling. You have no problem selling online, in person, on social media, and beyond. Gary, easy on the cha-ching.
Oh, sorry, but my Shopify sales are through the roof.
Start selling with Shopify today and discover how millions of businesses around the world use Shopify to ignite their selling. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
Hops are a required ingredient in beer, providing the bitterness necessary for balancing the malt sweetness as well as the desired flavor and aroma characteristics. However, unlike beer, where hops are added at multiple times throughout the process, hop water is treated a bit differently. Now, seeing as this show is largely beer focused, perhaps we should, I believe this is maybe our first, maybe second episode where we're looking at hop water. Let's start off by talking about what the hell hop water is in the first place.
So hop water is non-alcoholic. You're not having any sugar that you're converting. It's low to no calorie, sparkling water that is flavored with hops as the kind of the method of flavoring. And so obviously just like in beer, what variety of hops you use, how you decide to add them, whether you're doing, what method, which we'll kind of get into a little bit of that a little later, what method you're using, whether you're using heat or just kind of doing a dry hopping, that will influence the flavor of this beverage. But it's a really great non-alcoholic alternative that, for people like me, gives us just enough of that hop kind of flavor and aroma to maybe get through the week or get through a dry January or something.
Exactly. And I don't know what the original impetus was for Paul Tecker to create his very first batch of hop water. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it is a really, the way I hear a lot of people talk about hop water is that it is an alternative, an alcohol-free alternative that satiates that desire for what we love about hoppy beer, for what most people love about hoppy beer, which is the hop character. I also tend to like the other aspects of it, but I love sparkling water, and I've had numerous types of hop water. It really does convey the hop character surprisingly well, despite there being no malt or, no other sort of fermented, product in there or alcohol or whatever else. So it's a really neat, like I said, non-alcoholic alternative to beer if you're looking to, reduce your calorie intake, reduce your alcohol intake, whatever it may be. Now, my understanding, which Google helped me out a lot with this, is that back in 2014, a home brewer named Paul Tecker invented his first, I don't actually think he probably invented it well before this, but it was the first commercial hop water released in 2014. So you had this home brewer, which I just think is badass. You got this home brewer who's messing around with different things, decides to throw some hops in water. I'm sure he had a whole technique that he did over, numerous iterations. And he develops this stuff that is now, 10 years later, a relatively common thing among, beer lovers is, again, this near or alcohol-free water that happens to jibe with the popularity of sparkling water, and it's flavored by hops. I think it's pretty rad.
No, I think it's absolutely fantastic. And again, as I said earlier in the show, like as somebody that's got like sparkling water and has a lot of spare hops on hand, like it seems like kind of a natural progression that you would just try to combine these two things and see what you could get. So, and when you're at the brewery and you just want something kind of fizzy but you don't want, alcohol, I actually prefer hop water to like some of the non-alcoholic beers that are out there. It's just a little bit more refreshing for me. So I think this is a great alternative. And thank you, Mr. Tecker, for popularizing this idea.
Yeah. And if you are interested in trying the original, I believe it is the original commercial hop water, Paul Tecker is still involved, I believe. And his company's called H2 Ops. So H, the number 2 OPS. I've definitely seen it out there, and I've tried it many years ago. I was able to get my hands on some and thought it was really good. Since then, I've also had Hoppy Refresher from Lagunitas. I believe Hop Splash is from Sierra Nevada. That's another one I've had. Ex-Brulosophy contributor Ryan Hansen, in fact, is now in the business of making hop water, which is pretty cool. He's doing a local, I forget exactly what it's called, but it's a kind of like marketed towards golfers and such, so that they can have something refreshing and be able to go home and not get yelled at by the spouse, whoever that, how that works.
Well, and then you have companies, I think Hoplark's out of Denver, and they're doing like the antioxidant of all antioxidant beverages by making hop teas and all those things along with their hop water. So that's a really cool way to do it. And what's kind of neat is like, I think Lagunitas Hoppy Refresher and then Hop Splash from Sierra Nevada are two cool ones to bring up because they use some kind of wildly different methods to make that. Lagunitas is doing purportedly anyways, kind of a whirlpool and dip hop additions, whereas Sierra Nevada is doing everything kind of more of a dry hopping method, if you will. And we can dive into that a little bit later. But I think it's cool that you brought those up because those are two fun examples of how you can make really nice hop water using kind of really different techniques.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about hop water, I think a lot, when I first heard about it, and I'm telling you that, it was 8 years ago or so. You have to keep in mind, Brulosophy got started in February of 2014. That was the same year that H2 Ops went commercial. So it's been around for as long as Brulosophy has been. I just don't think it really got much fanfare until the last 5 or 6 years. And in fact, I believe it was 6 years ago that our own Jake Houlihan, old contributor of Brulosophy, who's no longer with us, but he published his Brew It Yourself article called H-Brew-O Hop Water, going over his method for making hop water, and he absolutely loved it. So it's not an unfamiliar or terribly novel product, but it does seem to be gaining more and more popularity, likely because of the seemingly, growing focus on health, being healthier and reducing alcohol intake overall. So I think it's pretty cool. Now there are a couple of considerations you want to make take when you're making hop water. Obviously, with beer, we often say, it's right around 95% water, give or take. And that's true. So you want to make sure your water quality is good. Well, with hop water, it is 100% water with some hops in it. So you really want to pay attention to the quality of your water. If your water has chlorine or chloramines in it, especially, you're really going to want to do what you need to get rid of that or go buy store-bought water. For me, the easiest way to get rid of it is just to use a tiniest little amount of potassium or sodium metabisulfite. You toss that in your water, and we're talking for a 5-gallon batch. It's like, less than a gram. It's like 0.7 grams for 5 gallons of water. A lot of people will throw in like a half a tab of Campden, something like that, but that will knock that chlorine and chloramine right out. It does it pretty quickly as well.
So I'm just kind of curious. This is just kind of like a thought process. And I did some Googling when I got the show notes and we, kind of going back and forth about stuff. But, chlorine and chloramines, normally that's like kind of a yeast byproduct where you get like the funky flavors from that. So I'm really curious if it does make a difference in hop water per se, because I was having trouble trying to nail that down. But, in all honesty, I don't want them in there if I'm making this product because it's just one more thing that can go wrong. But I am kind of a little bit curious since it's mostly yeast byproducts than I think of when I think of chlorine and chloramines. Like, does it actually make a difference? And I don't know the answer to that. Maybe somebody really smart who listens to this will know.
Well, I think there's two things with that. I thought the same thing, Will. And one, I don't like drinking chlorinated water anyways. I mean, I filter all the water that I drink. I've got a jug, a half-gallon jug of water next to me right now that has been filtered water, and I make sure that, I can't smell chlorine in my water. I can only imagine if it's already chlorinated and you can smell it from your tap, then mixing it to make a drink out of it it's just going to be not as good as if you didn't have it in there. That's part of what I'm saying. But another option that makers of, I'm not going to call them brewers, we'll call them, manufacturers of hop water can take into consideration is adjusting their water profile with different minerals. I make a lot of sparkling water. Like I said, my kids love it. My wife loves it. It's awesome. We always have at least one keg of sparkling water on tap. And I've adjusted the mineral profile many times. In fact, I found the San Pellegrino mineral profile. I made a batch of that. We tasted it next to an unadjusted batch and it was noticeably different. Is it, crazy, not really, but you can taste the difference. And so considering the fact that you're adding hops to hop water, it may very well, and we have not done any experiments on this, but it may very well help to, if you're going higher sulfate water, perhaps that's going to bring out more of that hoppy poppiness, if you will. I don't know, but it's something that I would certainly consider.
So actually, I think I did do an experiment on water chemistry where I added gypsum to one keg of hop water, and then did basically a clean water profile. And I think it came back significant. So adding minerals to your water profile is always going to come back significant, it seems like. And then I guess the other thing beyond that would be acidification, right? Because that's one thing that a lot of people are doing, is adding either citric acid or lactic acid or whatever they want to do. And it gives it a zesty, I guess more of a kind of a bite to it, or Christmas to it. But it also, the lower your pH gets, kind of the less likely things are going to go wrong downstream with your packaging, because, things don't like to grow in 3.5, 3.6 pH quite as well as they do it closer to neutral pH.
Yeah. No, I make, like I said, I make hop or regular sparkling water all the time, and without fail, I acidify it with about 7 grams of lactic acid. I mean, that's just, or 7 milliliters, same thing as grams. But I just know that by adding that to my filtered tap water, it's gonna make for a nice, crisp drinking water. It doesn't taste tart. It doesn't taste like you added acid to it. It just kind of adds this crispness to it that I tend to like in a cold drink of water, as weird as that sounds. Now, the other thing that a lot of people are talking about, I mean, a lot of people is relative to the number of people making hop water, of course, but that's come up quite a bit lately, and it's another one that we've done some experimentation on, is whether or not to use yeast in the process. Now, this, I'll be honest, Will, was kind of a new concept to me, and only really when Jordan was designing his experiment for it. So my understanding is that some hop water manufacturers add yeast to their product with the belief that it's going to contribute to like biotransformation, with the goal of hopefully amplifying the fruity characteristics of the hops. I don't know if there's another reason that they would do this. I know that Lagunitas does this with their Hoppy Refresher, but is there some other claim about using yeast in hop water that you're aware of, other than just amplifying the fruity hop characteristics?
Yeah, so this is just kind of like my own kind of personal belief, personal thoughts on this. Because I don't typically do the Lagunitas method where I use like the whirlpool and dip hopping. Normally, I'm kind of like more on the Sierra Nevada side of things, where I'm just adding in hops into, room temp to cold water, letting them sit for 24 hours, and then 24, 48 hours, however long, and then racking them off. So I think part of it is because, not that that's a different one, but Jordan's experiment came back significant, and they were obviously different looking. And so I think that when you're adding that heat, you are, kind of forcing things to oxidize or to go a little bit faster, because we know what heat speeds up chemical reactions. And so I think that yeast actually helps scavenge a little bit of oxygen inside of there that may prolong shelf life. And so biotransformation, maybe, I don't know, but it does, at least in theory, to me, makes sense that it's going to scavenge that little bit of oxygen in there and help promote shelf stability.
Yeah, that I view it as sort of like a prophylactic against staling as well. And that I've never made hop water. I probably will at some point. It's just my kids like plain water already. So, but yeah, it is an interesting idea. But it also, to draw back to the last thing we were talking about with the water quality stuff, is if you have any form of chlorine or chloramines in there, and then you're adding yeast to it, we are aware that is where these awful medicinal characteristics come from, is when the yeast interacts with the chlorine or the chloramine. So again, I would even more so want to make sure that is completely out of the water that I'm using to make my hop water, if that is indeed the case. Now, who really knows how that all works? I am not a beer scientist. We just do sensory analysis over here at Brewlosophy. So just again, some things that I would want to consider. You mentioned oxidation. Again, in Jordan's experiment that he did, the version of hop water that wasn't yeasted looked like it was oxidized. It looked like an oxidized hazy IPA in a way, which is super duper weird and very unique, because in all of the other hop water stuff that we've done at Brewlosophy, where the hop waters weren't yeasted, they didn't look like that. So I'd be so curious to know from somebody who's smarter than us, what in the world happened there. That being said, there are certain things obviously that can be done to hopefully mitigate or reduce the exposure to oxygen for your hop water. And it's all the same stuff you would do with beer. You can add a little bit of potassium or sodium metabisulfite, which is an antioxidant. And that's not going to hurt you at all. It's just going to react with the oxygen that is present, do a redox reaction, and hopefully get rid of it all before it has, has a bad influence on your water. You can purge your keg. I would highly recommend doing this, purging your keg with CO2 before packaging your hop water. I don't know. Anything else you can think of to just reduce the risk of the potential for oxidation in hop water?
So one thing you probably want to do is you want to maybe boil your water ahead of time to deoxygenate it. I guess you could also, if you had a nitrogen setup, you could nitrogenate your water. But I don't think most of us are going to spend the money to nitrogenate water when you could just boil it for 15 minutes, half an hour, and get all of that dissolved air out of solution. And so that might be another curious thing for an experiment. Deoxygenating your water through boiling versus not in the future. But yeah, that's pretty much what I would do is, boil the water. Although, honestly, when I'm doing it, I'm pretty lazy and I just dump, usually if I'm just doing it for myself and not for Velocity, I'll just dump 5 gallons of, water I bought from Walmart into a keg and call it a day.
Make it even easier, right? It's
Exactly.
kind of like a cider brew day where, it takes like 4 or 5 minutes to make a batch of cider and you're done. You're like, that was easy. God, I should do this more often. To get to the point, our main focus of this episode, perhaps one of the things that I've read, at least when it comes to people making hop water, that they're kind of torn about is how long do I leave this water in contact with the hops? Now, obviously, there are different times. Maybe we should talk about this first. In fact, is there are different ways to hop water. I know you mentioned that, Sierra Nevada is focusing more on kind of a dry hop. I put that in air quotes, kind of a dry hop method, whereas Lagunitas is doing like a dip hop, and they might add hops kind of late kettle, stuff like that. What's your experience with the different methods for hopping? And then let's move into your thoughts about the contact time or the exposure between those hops in the water.
So if I'm going to be perfectly honest, I've never really done the Lagunitas method, which I call it kind of a whirlpool dip hop, warm side hop oil extraction, I guess, is what you're doing, because when you read at least the one that I think More Beer has the article on how to do it, if you want to look it up, they even did a video, I believe, so you can go to morebeer.com and check out what they did. But it's definitely kind of a dip hopping plus a whirlpool, and I've never actually done that because that requires me to actually put in work to do dip hopping and whirlpooling, and it's more time. I've always been drawn to the dry hopping method, which is what Jake originally wrote about, and that's kind of where I started getting into hop water, was before I was a contributor to Velocity. I was a reader of Velocity, and so I read Jake's article, and I was like, man, this seems like super easy. Why would I not do this? And so I started doing that, and I think in Jake's article, he never even takes the hops out of the keg, and I've done that before. It takes a really long time for things to kind of round out and get drinkable, because otherwise you get this crazy bitter pine cone. And so kind of the next iteration for me is leave it in for a week and maybe pull the hops out of the keg. I have some of the kegs with the tabbed lids, and so you can either put it in a keg and rack it off the hop keg into another one with a floating dip tube in a keg, and you could rack off into another keg. Or what I was doing, because I was even lazier, is I had a little tab in it, and so you can tie dental floss to a little bag or one of those stainless steel hop tubes, and then when you're ready to get your hops out of there after some amount of time, then I'll just pull the lid off, pull the string out and cut it, and then just put the lid back on, purge it a little bit, and then it's basically ready to serve at that point. So I've kind of let the dry hop method, I've gone anything from 24 hours to to not even removing it from the keg. Again, part of it is just trying to get rid of that bitter pine cone flavor kind of as quick as possible, because it's not really drinkable when you have that bitter pine resinous thing going on. It's just too bitter. If you've ever eaten a hop cone, it's like you're drinking a slightly watered down version of that. It's not tasty.
Yeah, I remember when Jake made his H Brew O. If you Google HBR umlaut UO, that's going to be Jake's Brew It Yourself article. I forget his exact process. It is outlined obviously in that article. But I remember him commenting that right off the bat, when the hop water was first carbonated and he was going, maybe 3 or 4 days after making it, that he felt like it was just massively too bitter and not very drinkable and not very good. But that over the following, 5 or 6 days, it really came into its own and became far more pleasurable to drink. Has that been your experience? Are you noticing that you kind of have to give it time for that bitter, what you're calling bitter pine coney, for that to kind of mellow out?
So this is just my personal anecdote. So if you leave the hops in there, it takes maybe a month for that flavor to round out and for everything to fall out of suspension enough and calm down enough to be drinkable. The ones that I've actually, pulled the hops from it are more recently, I just kind of dump it all into a keg with a floating dip tube and then just rack it into another keg, push it over like we normally do with a closed transfer. When I do that, it seems to me like the longer you leave it in contact, kind of the longer it takes a little bit for that to mellow out a smidge. But that's just kind of anecdotally speaking. So, if you do 24, 48 hours, it'll be, at least in my personal experience or from what I perceive, it'll be a little less bitter hop cone if you get it off the hops in 24, 48 hours versus if you leave it in contact the whole time. It seems, again, to take at least a month for that to kind of mellow out.
God, that would be so annoying to make a batch of hop water, which is supposed to take just a couple of days, right? No, you don't have to worry about fermentation, none of that. And then to have to wait for a month to drink it. So I guess one benefit of the, a lower or a reduced hop contact time for hop water would be that you are able to drink it sooner. Pretty obviously. So let's talk a little bit about this, the kind of claims out there about different hop contact times. The traditional mentality when it comes to dry hopping beer, and by traditional, I will admit that I'm referring to the way I was trained way back in the early 2000s. 2003 is when I started, and IPA was on the skyrocket at that point. It was just moving up in popularity, and of course we all brewed it. And I just remember that if, first off, you were using huge bittering charges. At least that's how we did it up in the Pacific Northwest. And these beers were bitter. Boy, were they bitter, but that's what we were going for. And then you would add your dry hops in, but you always added, this is what I remember being told, wait until fermentation is over. We never talked about cold side oxidation, at least in the beginning. You would add a fairly moderate sized, dose of dry hops, and then you'd leave it in there for a week. But if you went even longer, then it's going to extract more of that good hop character that we're after. So we would often put it in, dry hop and leave it for 2 to 3 weeks before packaging the beer. And that was just kind of the way I remember, being told to do it. And I did it for probably 10 batches of a pale ale and IPA, hoppier versions of pale ale. It wasn't until, 2011, 2012, when I started hearing a lot of talk about what has since become termed, West Coast IPA, where they weren't doing any bittering additions. They were doing all late kettle and then these massive dry hops. And I believe it was Matt Brindleton from Firestone Walker, who I heard on a podcast talking about how they've found that a 24-hour to 48-hour dry hop is more than sufficient, and in fact can reduce some of the less desirable qualities from hops, like that, potential for grassiness or, vegetal flavors, which I've done a lot of dry hopping in my day. I don't really know if I've gotten that even from an extended dry hop, but it was that ultimately inspired me to start dry hopping for shorter amounts of times, which again, as an impatient person, is wonderful because I get to drink my beer sooner. What about you? What's been your experience with the hop contact time for dry hops in the first place?
So, usually with beer, I'm with you. Initially when I started with beer and dry hopping with beer, again, you got to wait till everything's over, let it go for a week or two. And, I don't remember the grassy vegetal stuff, but to be honest, I've never actually done too much of a hop contact time side by side in beer. I would think with beer, because alcohol is kind of a solvent, right? You may extract even more things than you would even with water, because water doesn't have quite that the alcohol in there to help extract some of those oils out of there. So, I'm with you, but I kind of like the idea of, 24, 40-hour dry hop time, maybe 3 days at max is what I'm seeing from people these days. Because again, I'm also impatient, and if I can turn a beer around quicker and start drinking it faster, that's good for me. And I've done quite a few beers at 72 hours or less, and had some pretty good success.
I'm telling you, I moved to 24-hour dry hops, and I like those beers just as much as I did the ones that I was leaving, when I'd leave the beer on the dry hops for a week or so. And we've done some experiments. We don't need to discuss all of those results right here, right now, but I have a feeling that the thinking about dry or hopping hop water, which again is usually just a dry hop or a dip hop of some sort, is pretty much the same. Some people believe that if it's in contact with the water for too long, you're going to get these grassy and vegetal notes. But if it's not in contact for long enough, it may not have enough time to extract what you do want. So again, it's something that makers of hop water are thinking about, and that's why we tested it out. Now, in the 2+ decades that I've been brewing, like I said, I've dry hopped well over 100 batches, some for up to 2 weeks, even longer than that at times, others for as little as 12 hours. And while I'm confident those contact times yielded different results, like I said, I've never personally tasted that grassy or vegetal character in my dry hopped beers. Of course, in beer, there's a lot more going on than there is in hop water, which leaves little for flaws to hide behind. So perhaps hop contact time does have an impact. That is exactly what you aim to find out in a recent experiment that you performed, Will, the results of which we're going to be focusing on after this break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Chilling wort can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brulosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to Exchillerator.com today.
O'Reilly. You've got questions? O'Reilly Auto Parts has answers. Need a pro you can trust? We've got that too. No matter what you need, our professional parts people have the training and expertise to help you do things right. Deep automotive knowledge. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts. Before Shopify, were you wondering, where are my sales at? Now you're selling with Shopify, the global commerce platform supercharging your selling. You have no problem selling online, in person, on social media, and beyond. Gary, easy on the cha-ching.
Sorry, but my Shopify sales are through the roof.
Start selling with Shopify today and discover how millions of businesses around the world use Shopify to ignite their selling. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
To my old way of thinking, the more time a certain thing spends in contact with liquid, the stronger the flavor contribution of that thing will be. Now, that may very well be true, but what the brewing data appears to indicate is that the quality of the flavors imparted by hops is less desirable when they spend a prolonged amount of time in contact with beer, while shorter contact times tend to yield more fruitiness, which is what so many brewers of beer are after. Curious how this plays out in hop water. You put it to the test, Will.
I sure did. So in order to test this, I did 2 5-gallon batches of hop water using store-bought distilled water. Essentially, I put it all into my Delta Brewing all-in-one systems, added 15 grams of gypsum, 7 grams of calcium chloride, brought both batches up to a boil. And this is fun. So normally I stagger batches. This, because it's so simple, I don't even think I staggered it by more than like 15 minutes just because, I was too busy doing one thing to the other to do them side by side. But normally I do like a half-hour stagger. But because of this one, I was going to treat it a little differently. I just boiled them both, got them up to boiling, let them boil for about 15 minutes, and then essentially racked into a keg and put it in a firm chamber to let it cool overnight.
So difficult. I mean, so far you're about 20 minutes into your brew day and you're already done. One thing I'm curious about, I know it's a little side topic, but you said you adjusted the waters with 15 grams of gypsum and 7 grams of calcium chloride, meaning that you're going to have a higher sulfate to chloride ratio. I'm curious what your thinking was with that.
So, my general, my frame of reference is beer, and typically I prefer a higher sulfate to chloride ratio. And so I was kind of just going with that same line of reasoning. Probably worth some experimentation on my part, and maybe an article or something to play with sulfate versus chloride versus sulfate, and those ratios. But I'm kind of going with that conventional wisdom from the beer world, which may or may not hold water here, pun intended.
That's why I laughed. Dad joke. I'm in the same boat. I would do the same thing, and in fact, I think I mentioned it earlier that when I'm just making regular old sparkling water, I always adjust with a little bit of calcium chloride and a little bit more gypsum just to ensure that I have that higher sulfate. I also add a little bit of acid, of course, and to me, it just makes it for all around crisper drinking experience, which I imagine would be the same way with hop water, and ostensibly could create more poppy hop character in that hop water. So you also said that you boiled the waters for 15 minutes to deoxygenate. This is something that I've seen some people do, some people don't do it. To me, again, I haven't made it yet. I plan on making a batch somewhat soon. I would do that just as a kind of to be cautious, to try to make sure that this hoppy water doesn't get, oxidized in the end, try to get as much of that oxygen out of there.
So if I'm being honest, when I just make it for not an experiment, I take the water from the store and just dump it straight in a keg, and I don't usually do this step. But again, sometimes for Brewlosophy, we do go the extra mile a little bit just to mind our P's and Q's. Another thing that's kind of controversial is like some people say 15 minutes isn't enough. Some people say you got to boil it longer. I don't know if there's any good data on that. I know 30 minutes to deoxygenate is kind of a lab standard, but boiling water by definition doesn't have dissolved gases in it. So I don't know how long, if you got an article to tell me, it's got a cool chart, how many minutes to get oxygen out of, dissolved oxygen out of water. I'd love to see it, but I couldn't find it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have one. So if you're asking me, I have to go look somewhere.
Our wonderful listening base. They're way smarter than we are. Haven't we made that abundantly clear?
That is abundantly clear, Will. So after you boiled these waters to presumably deoxygenate them, what did you do from there?
So once they were done, I just transferred them into sanitized kegs and then just threw them into my firm chamber for about 24 hours before adding the hops.
So I noticed this in reading that article, and when it first published, and then also when we were prepping these notes, that you did not chill the waters at all. And at this point, they're just water, right? It's water with a little bit of gypsum and calcium chloride, but there's no hops, nothing like that. You just boiled them to deoxygenate, and then racked that boiling water essentially into sanitized kegs, right?
So what better way to sanitize your keg than by putting boiling hot water in there? Is there a better way to do it? Like that it just seemed like it was, granted, I usually have Star San in my kegs when or if I don't have Star San, then I'll have, iota 4, but I have some kind of sanitizer in my kegs while they're sitting.
Yeah.
And they usually sit wet. I don't like to leave them sitting dry for whatever reason. I just like to keep the seals kind of moist and everything with sanitizer. But to me, I'm like, this is just extra insurance. I'm adding this in there. Like, why spend time and energy when I can just have hot water in there, doing a little bit of sanitization, and then just come back in 48 hours and finish what we're doing?
I mean, works for me. We know that boiling is one of the most effective ways to sanitize things. So, that's great. I would imagine that it heated up, it heated up your chamber fairly decently in the beginning, at least.
Yeah, thankfully there wasn't anything else sitting in there, so that was a good thing. But yeah, it does heat up the chamber. There's a little bit of energy usage there, but I wasn't dumping a bunch of water from an immersion chiller down the drain either. So that kind of is another pro, is a little bit more water friendly.
Yeah, for sure. So once they're cool, so you said you left them in there for a couple of days just to make sure that they were chilled down to where the temperature where you wanted to add the hops. Now, one thing that I noticed is that you went with 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 4 degrees Celsius. Is there a reason you chose that temperature for adding the hops? Other than convenience, or?
So, 40 degrees, I was talking with the gang, and one thing that people may or may not know is that Jordan Folks, he kind of co-authored an article about hop water and some of the better hop waters out there for Zymurgy. And, in chatting with him, he had done all this research, and the article hadn't been published yet, but apparently they talked to Dr. Shellhammer along with some other folks, and there was some really good data about dry hopping at cooler temperatures. And since that's kind of the trend now, too, if you read, Scott Janish's book, he talks about that as well, about dry hopping at colder temperatures and some of those things. And so I'm like, it seems like a good place to kind of institute that and just keep it cold. And then also when I dry hop my hop water, I tend to throw CO2 on it at the same time just so I can keep carbonating while things are happening. And we all know that colder temperatures seem to do better with absorption of CO2. So that's another reason as well.
I love it. Yeah, it actually is convenient, but in a different way. It's not like you were being lazy. There was a reason that you wanted to add the hops at this temperature. I think that's really cool. So tell us about how you added these hops, and then we can go into the variable.
Man, so I have floating dip tubes in both of these kegs, and so I literally pop the lid, dump the hops in, put the lid back on, and then just kind of did a quick spurt. So these are just hops, are just loose pellets going straight in there. No bag, no strainer, just a floating dip tube with a little bit of a, it's got the little metal screen on it to keep it from sucking up too much of the bad gunk. So that's all I was doing there.
And what hops did you use? What was your reason for picking the hop combination that you did?
So for this one, I did 57 grams, or 2 ounces each of Vista and Citra hops. And, Vista's a hop that, I haven't played with a ton of, but the times I've used it, I really liked it. And so kind of what I like to do is take a hop that I know I like in hop water, and Citra is one of those. It's a little bit pricier. And then I paired it with Vista, which is not as expensive because it's one of the, the public varieties that's out there. And I'm here to tell you, I really liked this hop combination. We'll get to the results later, but my wife commented this might have been the best keg of hop water that she's had. So pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love it. Vista, by the way, is a newer modern hop that is public, that isn't as expensive as things like Galaxy and Citra. You got to try this stuff. This is we're not paid by the folks who make Vista to advertise. It is a really cool hop. I've had a couple actual single hop beers made with Vista, and it really is quite nice. So I'm a big fan of that as well. And I could see it pairing really well with Citra. So that's really cool. Now, this is where the variable comes into play, because what we're looking at is hop contact time. So you add the hops to each of these waters in their kegs, and you are going to leave one for a specific amount of time and one for longer than that. Tell us a little bit about how you went about doing this experiment.
Right. So 24 hours after I added the hops from one of the kegs, I pressure transferred it off of those hops into another sanitized CO2 purged serving keg and placed it back in the same chamber, put it back on CO2. And then 6 days following that, so a full 7 days since the air quote brew day, I boiled some water day. All right, I didn't. What is even the day I boiled water? It was the day after I boiled water. So the second batch, a full 7 days of contact time. I pressure transferred it to a CO2 purged serving keg. And then, again, popped it back on CO2. They're both kind of hung out in my kegerator with 20 PSI of CO2 for 2 weeks for carbonation, mostly. One thing that people don't think about is water doesn't hold CO2 quite as well as beer, because with beer, there's lots of proteins and different things in there that kind of help keep the CO2 in solution. With stupid hop water, you're really having to push some CO2 in there, and so I usually keep it at 20 psi, maybe 25 depending on what we're doing, just to kind of keep it sparkling and effervescent. So just something to throw in there as we're going through this process. But yep, 20 psi, 2 weeks, and then we got to do the fun part where we got to taste the stuff.
Well, yeah, and I that obviously the fun part is what everybody's waiting for is, were they different? How did it impact the hop waters? But I will say, I just want to interject a little bit. Like I said, I make a lot of sparkling water at my house, and the way that I typically burst carbonate a beer is 50 psi for about 12 hours, then I knock it down to 20 psi for 2 or 3 days, and then I knock that down to my serving pressure of 14 psi, and we're good to go. With water, I'll go 50 to 60 PSI, go 24 full hours, and then knock it down to like 30 PSI just so I don't overcarb and have to deal with fixing that. Go 30 PSI for another day or two. I would imagine it's the same for hop water. All that's different is there's a little bit of hop flavor and aroma in there. I've done flavored sparkling waters many times, all of that. It's always the same process. So yeah, you're right. You have to reconsider the way that you're doing your carbonation. Also, sparkling water is supposed to be more effervescent than beer. It's supposed to be more like a soda as opposed to, that more moderate sparkle that you get in a beer. So now, before we go and collect the triangle test data that we are known for, we always do a series of, blind triangle tests. I say blind, we typically call it semi-blind. We know the variable, but when we're doing our series of triangle tests, it's not like we're serving them to ourselves. We're getting help with that. And so the odd drink out in this, this specific experiment, it's not a beer, is randomized. Let's talk a little bit about that. I also am curious what you saw, if there were any, appearance differences between these hop waters.
Yeah, so, we get to pour them side by side. If you go to the website, you can see the pictures. The 24-hour contact time is really bright, super clear. And it was, again, the one that had the 1 week batch might have had a slight haze to it. Still, nothing really major different between the two of them. Again, I could visually, if you kind of poured one, dumped it out, and then poured you another one, visually they were pretty similar. But the 7-day batch definitely had a slight haze to it.
I'm looking at the photos right now, and if you were to hand me a glass of the 1 week hopped batch after I chugged a 24-hour hop batch version of it, I'd think they were the same just based on the way they look. It's not like but side by side, if you're really squinting and, trying to evaluate the way they look, yeah, the one that was where the hops were in contact with it for a full week, it does look slightly hazier. You could still read a newspaper through it. I mean, it's still clear for the most part. I do think it's an interesting observation though. Probably, my presumption there is that it's an impact of the polyphenols and just being in contact for longer with the hops.
Definite possibility. And then the next thing I got to do was I got to do my own triangle test. And so I sat down, and out of 5 triangle tests, I guessed the right beer or the right hop water twice. So to me, I couldn't really taste the difference between these beers when doing triangle tests. And as I said earlier, it's kind of, it was really nice little fruitiness to it, a little bit of a kind of piney resinous on the finish, which is okay for that bitterness. But as I have to agree with my wife, I think this is one of the best batches of hop water that I've made. I think that Citra Vista hop combo and hop water is really good.
Yeah, it sounds delicious. And coming from the beer world, my expectation when we were designing this experiment was, okay, 1 week versus 1 day. Easiest way to look at it. You are going to get probably a more, what we would consider in this modern day of hoppy beer, a more, fruity, what you would expect from a hoppy beer. You're going to get more of that in this hop water that was hopped for just 1 day. And that 1 week hopped batch is going to be more grassy and probably a little bit more bitter is what I was presuming. The fact that you, despite fully knowing the variable and making these hop waters, you couldn't tell them apart and even admitted that the ones that you got right were lucky guesses. That, first off, is sets us up for where we're going with the experiment results with the blind tasters. But my goodness, that didn't make sense to me. I would expect a 24-hour or a 1 week dry hop in beer to be noticeably different, and in water to be even more so. And the fact is, it just didn't seem to be the case, at least based on your experience with these waters.
Right. And again, water's different chemical makeup than beer, because beer has alcohol in it, has a lot of other things. And then, pretty much hop water, you have higher, a more effervescent quality because you want it more sparkling, more spritzy. So there are some differences, but yeah, you would have expected definitely either if not more grassy notes, maybe just more like kind of resinacy pine coney notes from something that had a longer contact time.
Absolutely. Man, it's just really interesting already. So you ended up serving these hop waters, the triangle test, to 23 blind participants. By blind, they had no idea what the variable was. Now, of course, they knew it wasn't beer, that it was hop water. I think that's pretty easy to tell, though. That would be an interesting experiment, right? Like a lager versus a hop water. Yeah.
Oh, some people didn't want to do it because they're like, oh, I hate sparkling water. I don't like hop water. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's weird, but sure, cool. I get it.
I remember when I was a kid thinking that sparkling water was the grossest thing on earth, but I grew up drinking way too much soda. Now I don't drink any sugary soda, and or as they call it in other places, pop. But I drink sparkling water, a lot of it every single day now, and I'm glad that I've made the switch because it's far healthier. But again, you serve these hop waters to 23 blind participants, out of which we would expect 12 to identify the odd water out in order for us to say with some level of confidence that there seems to be this meaningful difference, perceptible difference between these hop waters that we could then point to the variable and say, well, it's likely that the hop contact time is at play here. In the end, how many people out of those 23 actually got the odd water out in the triangle test?
So in the end, only 7 people were able to tell the difference, which is right at 30%, which lines up just about with random guessing. So they were just kind of, in the same boat as me, guessing along. So this was a not significant result.
That is fascinating to me. Yeah, 7 out of 23 is actually just a hair under 1/3, which if you've got 3 cups and everything's identical, you'd expect 1/3, give or take, to pick each one. And that's exactly what happened here. So in this case, we can say, from a truly, purely scientific perspective, you would just say the null hypothesis, has been supported. So you can't really make much meaning out of that. But really, this is sensory analysis and we're Brulosophy. So whatever. What I'm going to say is that these, the results here seem to indicate that you can go 24 hours or you can go 7 days of hop contact time, and it's likely not going to have much of an impact on the perceptible characteristics of that hop water in the end. Where it is going to have an impact is you've added 6 days to your hop water manufacturing time now, and so if you are impatient like us and you're going those longer durations, you might want to scale back a little bit and maybe just go that 1 day or maybe even less. I mean, I'd be curious to see what 12 hours does compared to 24 hours. I mean, we know that things dissolve pretty quickly in terms of hops, at least. Maybe you get the same result there too. I just think it's fascinating.
And conversely, not the 12 hours would be interesting, but conversely, if let's say that I made a batch of hop water, which I did like a couple of days ago, and I still haven't gotten around to transferring them off of the hops yet because it's still sitting in my firm chamber at 40 degrees. Guess what? I'm not super sweating it right now because when I get time in the next day or two, it'll still be a week or less, and it's just like when I have time to do it, and I don't have to stress about doing it specifically at 24 hours because the difference isn't going to be significant.
Yeah, well, presumably, right? I mean, this is just one data point, of course. We got to make that disclaimer every time, but I do think it's interesting at the very least. Now, we did get some reader comments on this. Surprisingly, we got quite a few reader comments, which seems to indicate that there's quite a bit of interest in making hop water these days, which I think is pretty rad. So the first one comes from Matt Giovanisi, who says, "How do you avoid clogging the dip tube with all them hops loose in the keg?"
So, I have on my floating dip tubes, I have some that have like this little plastic with like a metal cage around it. And so essentially like the little cage is going to keep it from clogging the inside of the dip tube. And generally speaking, when you keep stuff cold, it falls out, like especially hops, like after they kind of get saturated and hang out for a while, they do fall out of suspension after a little bit. So, 24 hours, they should have been kind of hanging out at the bottom of the keg anyways for the most part. So between the floating dip tube, between just hops doing what they do and kind of falling out of suspension, it wasn't really a big deal. It didn't clog at all.
Another little trick that old time, Brulosophy contributor Greg Foster used to do is he would take his dip tube, the liquid out tube out of this keg, and then he would take a mesh screen, drill a tiny little hole in the top of it just so that the dip tube fits in there, and then he would slide the dip tube on into the inside of that mesh filter so that then you could could loose hop the whatever's in your keg, water, beer, whatever. And then when you're drawing it off, you've got so much surface area of that screen there that, yeah, the bottom of it might clog a bit, but you're still sucking beer in. And he said it works really well. So that's another option as well. I've never done it. And then you can also, like, I think you mentioned it earlier, use a hop bag and then put, some unflavored dental floss on it. All kinds of tricks for doing that. But that's the way I would do it as well, is just adding the bags into the keg. Next comment comes from Kim, who says, it's not surprising contact time with beer does make a difference. He's referring to a past experiment there. While contact time in hop water does not, beer is a whole concoction of sugars, yeast, most importantly, in my opinion, and enzymes, with all sorts of reactions happening even at terminal gravity. I'd wager in that other hop contact time experiment, yeast sitting for 11 extra days created some unsavory character, such as autolysis. I'd be more concerned with that than grassy or vegetal flavors extracted from the hops. To me, it makes sense that in water, all those other reactions are eliminated. That would be my main takeaway from this experiment, that with beer dry hopping, you want enough contact time for the hops to mix, but after that, funky stuff could start happening related to yeast. In a professional setting, my goal is to get the hops to travel through the product and then get them out, especially because they drag unhappy yeast down with them. That process in a heavily dry hopped IPA could take 2 to 3 days, dumping what's on the bottom and rousing the knockdown what is still afloat on top, sometimes both of those processes twice a day. I believe this experiment validates my own process, so that is cool.
Well, I'm always happy to validate people. But yeah, and also the one thing Kim did mention is there's also alcohol in beer. And so that also acts as kind of a solvent and kind of helps strip things out, pretty quick as well, and may strip more things out over time. I don't know if we have any experiments to show that on our end, but that's definitely great points.
Yeah, the alcohol thing is a big one for me because we know that alcohol is a solvent and that that's a big part of what it extracts from hops and all of that. But also, like you mentioned earlier, Will, there's this kind of I guess matrix, right, from the proteins from malt and hops, polyphenol, all these things that are gonna quote hold on to different hop characteristics, and it's gonna just react differently in beer than it does in water. So I'm glad too, Kim, first off, that we validated your experience. That's great. Also, you're a brave person mentioning that you're a commercial brewer on this show. But next comment comes from Kevin Promise, the great Kevin Promise. He left it on our Facebook page. He says, I just leave mine in the mesh dry hopper tube for the duration and pull from a floating dip tube. I haven't had too many problems, minus maybe having to dump the last couple pints because there's some, quote, salad in there.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely had the good green vegetable stuff coming out. It's pretty... Again, when you get those pints with a little bit of the hop particulate in there, it is so resinous, so pine coney. It's like you went and chopped down a pine tree and tried to drink it or something. However you would do that. So it's not a good flavor. I just found that when I left the hops in there, I think I talked about it earlier. Like it just kind of takes a lot longer for some of those resinous characters to kind of fall out a little bit. And so to me, maybe the floating dip tube is the answer, because I think I usually put this in normal kegs when I do it this way. For whatever reason, I have some kegs that have full length dip tubes, some that I've cut, and then some with floating dip tubes. So I have to keep all those marked and organized well. Maybe I should just standardize, but yeah, maybe the floating dip tube helps because all that hot particulate's like falling out of suspension a little sooner, and so you're drawing from the top. But yeah, I just tend to like to get those hops out of there just so that I don't have that kind of chance of getting that vegetable resinousy glass, whether at the beginning or the end.
Yeah, I'm also way too anal to do that. I would definitely transfer it out of the first keg into a serving keg. Also, I have this idea, and I could be off on this, but that would sort of lock in the character of that hop water, and so it's not going to change, or at least much, over time, whereas who knows what's going to happen if you just leave those hops in contact, Final comment comes from Paul Troutman, who says, wouldn't the presence of sugars, proteins, and particulate from malts account for the increased perception of hop aroma and flavor? That's sort of what I was presuming earlier, is that yes, that matrix of particulates, sugars, proteins, all of that stuff in beer would have some sort of an impact on the way we perceive the hop character in beer compared to water, which has none of that stuff.
I think that's absolutely kind of a same observation that I have. I think again, if we use this amount of hops to dry hop a beer, I think it's going to present itself much differently than what it does in hop water. So while we kind of use hop water as this like non-alcoholic alternative to beer, it doesn't taste like beer per se, other than it does have some similar characteristics that hops provide both. But they are definitely different beverages, and they taste different. And again, the alcohol, the malt extraction, the yeast character, all those things kind of add to the gestalt as a whole of beer. Whereas this is pretty much at least the way I make it with the dry hopping method, pretty much a very naked beverage with just hops, water, and a lot of carbonation.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so refreshing and tasty. Again, a great alternative, but it's not beer. So, well, that is all the time we've got on the impact Hop Contact Time has on hop water. Anything else you'd like to add, Will?
I think we've covered most of it.
All righty. Don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Brewlosophy's Kate Job takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss the fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.